The war parliamentary briefing tonight. In the days gone by when ordination of women bishops was a great issue, Parliament would be absolutely stuffed full of MPs opposing it. There's now nobody opposing it. The business collapsed after half an hour and the order has all gone through, which is better than it used to be. Let's be optimistic, please. We've got a full house this evening, and we've also got an overflow meeting in the Grimond room just down the corridor. We were trying to fix up a television link, but unfortunately it couldn't be done in time to have them in that room. So when the speakers have concluded their remarks here, they're going to go down to the Grimond room and repeat them all over again. So if you really enjoyed the first time, you could follow them, you could follow them down the corridor and confirm they're saying exactly the same thing at the second meeting. But it's not a problem. It reminds me of the foundation meeting of the Stop the War Coalition Friends Meeting House in 2001, when we had 7 overflow meetings because the meeting was so big. So thank you all very much for coming. The purpose of the meeting is an update on the situation of the wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Mali, Libya, Syria, now Nigeria, and also there are issues all around the world about abuses of human rights and arms sales, such as the British base that has now been constructed in Bahrain to return to an East of Suez policy, despite our own Foreign Office saying there are human rights concerns in Bahrain. And also there are friends here from Mexico who are fighting up there against abuses of human rights, while at the same time the British government is cozying up to them on business and arms deals. Some things never change. Our meeting tonight is designed to expose and open up all those issues. So I'll go through the speakers in order, but there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion. And I also hope, if you're not already on the Stop the War mailing list or signed up to receive our newsletters and information, there are sheets going around, so please be good enough to put your email on that. Without further ado, the first speaker I want to introduce is somebody that lightens up my life once a week by his column. Could you give a very warm welcome, please, to Seamus Milne and his columns in the Guardian.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and thanks for all of you for coming tonight and queuing to get into this exceptionally secure building. I mean, this meeting is supposed to be about a new year of war, and it is certainly an alarming and dangerous picture that we face in terms of global conflict, which is spreading and growing all the time. 10 days ago we saw the atrocities in France, which, as in the case of similar events here, are quite clearly the product of the past 13 years of the war on terror and France's role in it in particular. And they are both fueling anti-Semitism and rampant Islamophobia as these interventions go. We've seen, in response to the French attacks already, the French government sending a new warship to the Gulf and clamping down on civil liberties and Muslim community activists in France. And here in Britain, David Cameron, is demanding more surveillance powers. And I was just listening on the radio as I came down here to his response to the complaints from the Muslim Council of Britain today about the letter sent out to mosques across Britain. And he was saying it's completely reasonable that they make clear their allegiance to Britain. Everything and anything is the cause of this and these attacks, except the one thing, the elephant in the room, which everyone else in the world can see, but not the government's concerned, which is the wars they are waging in the Arab and Muslim world. We've got conflicts multiplying on 3 continents. In an arc of war, military intervention, and state breakdown from Afghanistan to Nigeria. In Iraq and Syria, the so-called Islamic State, the mutant offspring of the war on terror, is now the renewed target of United States, British and French military intervention. In Ukraine, thousands have died in proxy fighting between Russian-backed rebels and the NATO-sponsored government in Kiev. And in the Far East as well, you've got tensions rising between China and the US and its allies in the region as the US tries to maintain its control of a whole part of the globe. And in most of these conflicts, the British government and British forces are in the thick of it and making matters worse, I would argue, in the process. Now, the current conflicts in the Arab and Muslim world in particular, I would say, are the product of the failure of the first phase of the war on terror. Because in Afghanistan and Iraq, we saw how the United States and Britain and their allies demonstrated the limits of American and Western strategic power rather than its extent. And we saw that reflected in the withdrawal from Iraq, in the case of British troops from Basra in the middle of the night, and a few weeks ago from Afghanistan, the withdrawal of regular troops was held in secret for fear of Taliban attacks. But they're not letting go, of course. We've got the return to Iraq taking place right now with 13,000 trainers US trainers, so-called trainers in Afghanistan, and thousands of troops returning to Iraq in special forces, in bombing raids, and in so-called advising and training roles. And of course, in response to the Arab uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, there was an attempt by the United States and its Western allies to regain their foothold and their dominance in the region through a process of trying to crush the uprisings, to hijack them or to divert them. And that happened in Syria, in Libya first, in Bahrain, as Jeremy's referred to, in Syria through proxy wars, and in Yemen. And the result throughout the region has been intensified civil war, the return of the most brutal dictatorship in Egypt, and the strengthening of the autocratic, authoritarian Gulf regimes on which Western power in the Middle East depends. They are sponsoring and at the same time fighting different groups of rebels in Syria. And only a few weeks ago, the British government proudly announced, at this most fraught and dangerous of times, that 40 years after the withdrawal from the so-called East of Suez, the withdrawal of British forces permanently from the Gulf under a Labour government in the late 1960s, they were returning to the region in force. There will now be a new British military base in Bahrain, just as the French government set one up recently in the United Arab Emirates, to protect security and so-called stability in the region. This Bahraini regime that the British government is supporting and standing behind has repressed its own people in the most brutal way. The most that they'll admit is that there are human rights issues which need discussion and debate as the base is set up. Now, if the Middle East maelstrom that we've been talking about is the fruit of the attempts to re-establish the United States-dominated order in the region, Ukraine and the Ukrainian war, you could say, is the result of the challenge to the unipolar world that started to break down in the process of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it was precisely the attempt by NATO and the Western powers to draw Ukraine into the Western camp and to expand NATO, an alliance which was supposed to be a defensive one, right up to the Russian border into the heartlands of the former Soviet Union, that triggered this crisis, and that led to the overthrow of the elected president a year ago in Kiev. And that has triggered a full-scale regional war, which now involves far right-wing militias fighting in eastern Ukraine, backed by the British government, the United States, and other Western powers. So far from keeping the peace, NATO has shown itself to be a threat to peace in that entire region. And the war on terror that was launched in the autumn of 2001 has now become a permanent war in a sort of Orwellian mould, where it's a war without end, where every response and every intervention escalates the war, and a politically constructed national security trumps the actual security of citizens every time, and feeds a campaign of Islamophobia and an attempt to discipline and intimidate the Muslim community that we're seeing played out in this country every single day, at the same time as liberties are torn up for all of us. And that war is clearly growing and spreading again. We're no longer talking about hundreds of thousands of troops and boots on the ground as took place in Iraq and Afghanistan in the first phase of the war on terror. So the torture and kidnapping that we saw played out in the CIA report so graphically a few weeks ago is now being replaced by mass drone attacks carried out through a whole wave of countries. The use of special forces and trainers, new bases, air attacks, bombing campaigns and covert wars. That is how it's being played out now, from Pakistan to Yemen, Kenya to Somalia, Mali to Libya, Iraq and Syria to Afghanistan. And as the former French Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin, who became famous all over the world in 2003 for the adamant refusal that he expressed of the French government to join the illegal aggression against Iraq in 2003. As he said last week in the frenzy of the post-Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, that ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, is the direct product of Western policy and military interventions, and its military campaigns are boosting it. As he said directly, the West's wars always nourish new wars and terrorism amongst us, which I think sums the situation up very graphically. But one of the problems we've got here, and it's very appropriate that we're holding this meeting here in Parliament, is that all the three main political parties' leaderships support the broad thrust of this war on terror and its various manifestations. It's perfectly correct that the Labour Party played a powerful role in pulling back from the attack on Syria that was going to be launched in the autumn of 2013. And Ed Miliband criticised the war in Iraq and distanced the Labour leadership from that. But they are now putting their weight behind the new Bahrain base. They supported, of course, the intervention in Libya and the new campaign in Iraq. It means there's a democratic deficit on policies which affect this country crucially, but do not, by and large, have the support of the British people, or, by the way, the peoples of most of the other intervening countries as well. So the support for dictatorship, which we've seen played out in the last few years, and the support for these wars is not something that's either in the interests of the region, of the people of the Arab and Muslim world where the wars are carried out, or in the interests of the people of the countries and the states doing those interventions. But it's become, I think, more difficult to campaign and mobilize over these issues because of the fact that there are fewer troops, and for many people the wars have become so complicated they're lost in what's actually going on. But in the interest of justice and security, and of course community relations in this country and many others, it's more important than ever. So the public pressure that brought the troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan and stopped the attack on Syria in 2013 has to get much stronger and be ramped up much more if this process and this brutal and spreading war without end isn't to engulf us all. Thanks very much, Rob.
Seamus, thank you very much. Absolutely superb. Now you can do it all over again. in the Grimmin room.
I might go to the Grimmin room.
Are they down there? There's a good crowd waiting. Nicolette will take you there. Thank you very much, Seamus. You'll come back, won't you?
Of course.
If they let you.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry about having to have 2 rooms, but it's a good problem to have. Thanks very much, Seamus. Could you please give a very warm welcome to our next speaker, Andrew Murray, who's Chief of Staff, Head of the Administration of Unite the Union, member of the TUC General Council, but also the founding chair of the Stop the War Coalition, and served in that capacity for the first 10 years of our existence, and it also has done a phenomenal amount to build the anti-war movement in this country. Please welcome Andrew Murray.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy, and welcome to all of you at this tremendous meeting. There is an enormous queue outside trying to get in. I was stuck in that queue for a time, and I was thinking, by the time I get to the front of this queue, maybe the Chilcot report would have been published. As if. Let me start by reading a bit to you from Time magazine, the latest issue of Time magazine, in a course of an article about the position following the massacres in Paris. So what's to be done? The list of failed solutions seems to grow longer by the week. Large-scale military invasions? Nope. Trillion-dollar nation-building efforts? That's Time speak. Nope. Capturing, possibly torturing, even killing senior leaders? Nope. Though many of these efforts continue to some degree, none of them have produced the results their authors intended. Well, ain't that the truth? Here we are in the 13th year of the War on Terror, 13th year still, a war that has laid waste to a huge swathe of the planet, from West Africa to South Asia, has destroyed states, has killed hundreds of thousands and probably millions, has displaced certainly millions, has impoverished peoples across the planet, has poisoned community relations and civil liberties, even where the war has not directly bitten. It has produced the torture of Guantanamo, now been graphically revealed in testimony in The Guardian this week, the torture of Abu Ghraib. It has been fought by armies, drones, spies, police, torturers, and now it appears they're saying to no avail. I think it was Napoleon Bonaparte's chief of police who said after a particularly ill-judged execution, "This is worse than a crime, it is a blunder." And that cannot be our view. The crimes are much worse than the blunders, but we are in a position now where the dangers facing the world are greater than they were at the outset of this exercise. And I guess the tremendous attendance of this meeting tonight is testimony to the growing awareness of that. It's been a monumental failure, and it was ostensibly set out at the beginning to tackle one terrorist organisation holed up in one state, Afghanistan. We now have a situation where, as predicted at the time, I remember George saying these very things 13 years ago, Hydra-headed, it has multiplied now across the world, as Seamus has said, as a result, as a direct consequence of the policies followed by the American, British and other governments. And if you look at this litany, it's important to say one thing. Of course, we condemn the barbarism of the attacks in Paris, the attacks on journalists and the hideous anti-Semitic attacks. Just in case anyone from the Daily Mail is here, I will say that again. They sometimes get this wrong, it's irritating for me and expensive for them. We condemn the attacks in Paris unreservedly. But we also need to say that the barbarism we condemn in Paris is minute compared to the barbarism wrought by imperialism across the planet in the last 13 years, and we must condemn that barbarism. There is a sad lesson we have to relearn from the attacks in Paris, and it needs bringing home again and again. wars are no longer over there. They are no longer the wars of the neo-colonialist dreams, where an obliging army of Mahdi-led Islamists advances across the sands, be mown down by the Gatling gun, and no one hears anything about it until the report is published in the Times 3 or 4 weeks later. The wars in Palestine have their echo in Paris. What happens in Baghdad will happen in Britain. That has to be understood. We cannot think that you can draw a quarantine zone around the wars we are fighting. A solution somewhere has to be a solution everywhere. And this crisis will not be solved by bombing, by invasions, by new acts of aggression, nor will it be solved by pressure, racist pressure on the Muslim community in Britain, in France, or anywhere else. As famous Milne said, the present situation is entirely a consequence of Western policy in quite specific ways. The great pundits and panjandrums of Western foreign policy say terrorism flourishes in failed states. So what have they done? Failed one state after another, torn down or contributed to the tearing down of one functioning state after another. Syria, Libya, longer ago Iraq. It's not a matter of Saddam Hussein, a matter of the destruction of Iraqi society and the state. And then ISIS flourishes. Elsewhere, Al-Qaeda flourishes. The wars and the suppression of the democratic movements in Egypt, in Bahrain, less celebrated, less well known, in Kuwait and in Jordan, at every turn supported by Western governments. These are the timber that fuels the rise of organisations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and it is our policy that is doing it. And then we get surprised that we get what could be called blowback. David Cameron, William Hague, they were saying the main problem in the Middle East is the Assad regime. The Assad regime must be brought down by all means possible. Some misguided youths across Europe go off to give effect to that policy. No sooner than they do so, than they're arrested, or they're threatened with arrest. The farce is compounded when, in my own part of London, now ISIS is demonised as the main enemy we have to fight. A young Kurdish woman proposed to take herself off to the north of Syria to fight ISIS, and she's been arrested. The worst thing you can do is try and support British foreign policy, it seems, as you immediately get incarcerated on return. So, what is to be done? That is the question that is asked in all good faith by many people now. The list of things that must be done by Britain, the British government, is a list of negatives, and I think unashamedly so. It must stop invading sovereign states that pose no threat to our country at all. It must stop bombing at the behest of the American government. It must stop writing blank cheques for Israel and its oppression of the Palestinian people. It must stop supporting Saudi Arabia, the hotbed of reactionary theocracy in the Middle East, and the other Gulf dictatorships. And it must stop the relentless Muslim baiting here and abroad. What we must do is to stop doing what we have been doing and do nothing else. Because this is already an endless war. It didn't even begin 13 years ago. In the Middle East, we have intervened against democracy in Iran in the 1950s. We've intervened against Nasserism, against Baathism, against communism, against Gaddafiism, against Islamism. The common theme is the intervening to suppress and subdue regions and peoples that want by one means or another to find the independence and the dignity that we take for granted here. So all our demands must be for our government to do less, and we can make no apology for that. The world is a very dangerous place. We could hold a similar meeting on the problems in the Ukraine, caused in large part by the relentless effort to expand NATO, about the dangers in the Far East with the movement of American military resources into a very volatile region. But I think the main thing to assert today, loud and clear, is that the greatest danger the world faces is not terrorism, it is imperialism, and when we deal with the greater problem, the lesser one will start to evaporate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Excellent contribution, and presumably you'll be able to come back after you've done the overflow meeting in the Grimman room. Can I now ask you to give a very warm welcome to my colleague and friend George Galloway, who's going to speak to us next. George.
Jeremy, listening to your introduction and my friends Seamus and Andrew, I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or cry, though cry was the most likely outcome. It is surreal to hear collated in this way everything that we in the anti-war movement predicted 13 years ago, almost to a T. Mr. Blair likes now to say that he has been surprised by the subsequent course of events. But that's just another lie, because he heard it from millions, even when they didn't know what they know now, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that the entire thing was a tower of lies. But he heard it face to face, man to man from me outside the gentleman's lavatory in the library corridor of the House of Commons, to be precise. I told him that the fall of Baghdad would not be the beginning of the end, but just the end of the beginning. I told him there were no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but if he and Bush invaded, there would be hundreds of thousands of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that the extremists would descend like spores on the wounds that he and Bush were ready to open. I told them that if you invade and occupy Iraq with hundreds of thousands of Western soldiers in George Bush's crusade, extremism will cascade all over the world. Even, I said, in our own country, more than 2 years before it did on 7/7/2005. I talked about this Hydra at this point. Alistair Campbell, about whom more later, pulled him away because it was threatening to get physical. So it is surreal to me to hear you and Andrew and Seamus adumbrate the theatres of conflict. And I won't repeat most of them. But Seamus said that, or you did, Jeremy, welcome to this very secure building. Well, we must hope it is a very secure building. If it is one of the few in this country that can be so described as a very secure building. I want to talk about our prediction that if you make war against Muslims abroad, you will end up at war with Muslims at home. Nothing could be more certain. If you pump the air full of hatred of Muslims, Muslim leaders, Muslim countries, rogues, terrorists, do you expect the tabloid media and other sections of the media, do you expect the right, the racists, to make a distinction between that Muslim over there and the one praying in the mosque on my street, or who owns a shop or a restaurant just around the corner from me? What kind of level of consciousness do you imagine exists that if you demonize Islam and its various leaders to the extent that you are doing, you are sowing dragon's teeth and you will reap the whirlwind? And we haven't yet, not since 2005. But I can tell you, it's not a state secret, and if it is, I'm going to tell you anyway, that the head of the British Security Services says that an attack in Britain is, and I quote him, virtually inevitable. Now, he may not have meant it quite so strongly. He did have a price tag at the end, asking for more money and more resources. But if it is virtually inevitable, that means it's almost certain to happen. If I told you it's virtually inevitable when you go out there that you're going to be knocked down by a bus, you wouldn't cross the road. So we must assume that he's telling the truth and that some kind of variant of these Paris atrocities is coming our way, which of course will add yet another twist, yet more hatred, yet more bigotry, yet more recruits for the extremists and the fanatics. So the wars that you are describing and discussing this evening have to include the war at home. It turns out that we have the opposite of what we need. We need smart, better intelligence. But we have fools, it would appear, in charge of our security. I just read The Guardian tonight that GCHQ has been busy hoovering up the emails of the journalists on the BBC, The Guardian, the Daily Mail, The Sun, Reuters, NBC, ABC. Did they think that there might be some jihadists working for the Daily Mail? Is this the use to which they're putting the money and resources that they have? They're spending billions, we don't know how many, because it's a state secret, it's not revealed. But they couldn't keep track of the two fanatic murderers who decapitated Lee Rigby in broad daylight in a South London street. They have, again I hope it's not a state secret, they have for the first time in British history dispersed the SAS across the country. No longer based in one place, Hereford, but dispersed around the country, because they believe that this attack, Mumbai-style attack, when it comes, will take place in what they call the provinces, rather than in London. And they need to have SAS soldiers nearby for a quick reaction. So this is a pretty disastrous situation that we face. And it is all, of course I'm not exculpating the actual murderers who should be in prison for 99 years, the people who killed Rigby. But that doesn't mean we can avoid telling the truth, as I told William Hague in the lift in this very building. I told William Hague, these two people who killed that soldier in South London, if they'd gone to Syria instead, you would have paid their airfare. You would have bought them the knives. Our policy of supporting from the 1980s until now, this day, David Cameron's just announced, we are going to be training moderate Islamists in Syria and hoping they don't defect to Al-Qaeda or ISIS as soon as we have trained them, like all the weapons we gave, which were immediately stolen by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Our policy of building these Frankenstein monsters around the world is proof that they never read the novel Frankenstein to the end. For if they had, they would know that once you've built it, it's out of your control. That's why it's called a monster. Once you've created it, it will do whatever it likes. And that's exactly what has been happening It's what happened in France, it's what happened in Belgium, and if the security services here are to be believed, it's virtually inevitable that it's going to happen here. One last point before I go to the Grimond room, Jeremy. Somebody asked me today in an interview, what can we do to stop this radicalization? Should we ban WhatsApp? Should we stop these preachers of hate in tabloid speak? Should organizations like Hizb ut-Tahrir and others be proscribed? I told the interviewer the only thing necessary to radicalize a Muslim in Britain today is the ability to watch the television. Last summer, everybody, including the 2 million Muslims, watched not just the slaughter of 2,160 Palestinians trapped in the Gaza Strip, 500 of them children, the majority of them women and children, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Not only did they have to watch that happening, they had to watch our government supporting the murderers. They had to watch our government supporting those carrying out the slaughter, as did the French and Muslims everywhere. Crikey, what is remarkable is that there are so few fanatics, so few extremists. Not that there are so many. So Seamus is right, Andrew is right. What is to be done? The opposite of what we're doing. It's not rocket science. We should do nothing else and reverse that which we are doing on the principle that when you're in a hole, stop digging. We should stop supporting the murderers in Gaza and start supporting the victims of the murderers in Gaza. We should stop invading and occupying one Muslim country after another and subverting one Muslim country after another, backing the extremists in Syria, supporting the military junta in Egypt, and so on. We should stop it and let the people of those countries decide their own future. Stop propping up these rotten, corrupt dictators who rule the Muslim world almost without exception from one end to the other. Saudi Arabia, which was at the front of the march in Paris, by the way, the Saudi ambassador was marching for press freedom and freedom of speech in Paris in the very week that they were lashing with a whip in public 50 times for the next 20 weeks. Someone who wrote a blog criticizing not Islam, not the Prophet, criticizing the corrupt appointees in the religious establishment who are merely stooges of the kleptocracy that run Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is our best friend. We are never done trying to sell them more weapons. We are never done trying to send them more trainers. When they invade their neighbor Bahrain, we support it. How seriously can any Muslim take our protestations of being in favor of freedom and liberty, freedom of speech, when our best friend is the dungeon of the region and the unfreest country on the earth? Thank you very much indeed for coming.
George, thank you very much indeed. You're hearing an analysis tonight of the whole process of the war on terror, which is not something you hear every day on the mainstream media or in most of the newspapers. And so, but we can use social media to get a message out, and the hashtag for tonight is hashtag #NoWar2015. No War figures 2015. So if you want to send a message out, please do, and that helps to get the message out a bit wider. Those people who are sitting at home shouting at their television are not actually that isolated or that alone at all, and it's quite important to create that sense of community and coherence in our opposition to this whole strategy. Can I now ask you to welcome our next speaker, very great friend of mine, Sami Ramdani, who is Iraqi, born in Iraq, and I had the most fascinating evening with him a couple of weeks ago. We sat for 2 hours in a cafe on the Holloway Road discussing the history of Iraq and the Middle East. The conversation only ended because the cafe had to close. Otherwise we'd have stayed all night. Absolutely fascinating, great friend, and has written a great deal on the whole issues surrounding the area and taught an awful lot of people the real truth about the history of the region. Please welcome Sami Ramdani.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think I have to discard my speech basically, because what you heard from George and the other speakers, Seamus and so on, just about covered everything I had written. What I will try to do, not to repeat what they had said, which I think was excellent contribution, throwing light at a very complex situation behind these misleading headlines. So what I'll try to do is, I jotted some notes down quickly while they're talking, is to stress issues that perhaps time did not allow them to go into. One is that how do we combat the hysteria that's being generated by the media? And don't underestimate it. I'm delighted there is such a big crowd tonight, but there are millions out there whose only access to the news is through the mainstream media. They switch on BBC, ITV, they pick up their newspaper the next day. They don't hear what you hear here. They have no access. They don't have the time. They run families. They have to work very hard day and night to make a living and so on. They do not have time to go, even if they are willing to do so, to go and research and find out the truth. So this hysteria that the media is creating is extremely dangerous and damaging. And unless all of us, in whatever way we can, combat this hysteria will have an effect on the public. And the effect that it will have, whether it's France or here, is to stir up feelings of racism, of fearing the unknown, and the unknown here is a monster being created out of the Muslim community or black people or whatever the media creates as a monster for the time being. And monsters that the media create change from one historical period to the next. Early 20th century and up to World War II, it was the Jews. After World War II, if we talk about Britain and the rise of immigration, black immigration into Britain in the 1950s onwards, it became black people and mugging. Young black people became the monsters that young people have to fear when it's dark in the street. And for the last 15, 20 years, and if you want a precise date, since the overthrow of the Shah of Iran in 1979, it's been Islam and Muslims. And you're talking about 1.5 billion people across the globe. You're talking about millions of people who made Europe their home. And that is a really poisonous, dangerous policy. We constantly hear, and rightly so, about the Holocaust. One of the biggest lessons, if not the biggest lesson of the Holocaust, is not to repeat it. But if we allow our politicians and our media to generate so much fear, so much hatred, then you are bound to create an atmosphere in which killing these people becomes justifiable, mistreating them, regarding them as subhuman. This is how racism worked during the Atlantic slave trade until today. Dehumanize your enemy to such an extent that you regard them as subhuman, therefore killing them or abusing them or mistreating them becomes justifiable because they are monsters. This is very, very dangerous what our politicians are doing, and they are doing it in our name. And the process of demonization is so dangerous. Look at what they did in Iraq. I was born in Iraq. I lived most of my young years in Baghdad. They destroyed a great country through a process of demonizing one person. Saddam was our dictator, yes, a brutal dictator. I was one of his victims. So were millions of Iraqis, the majority of the Iraqi people. But they demonized Iraq as a country because through the process of demonizing one person called Saddam. And this process of demonization convinced millions of people, even though there was a majority here in Britain against the war, but still, there were millions who were convinced that this country called Iraq posed a danger to the whole world. Instead of leaving it to the Iraqi people to overthrow their dictator, they sent in hundreds of thousands of troops. They destroyed Iraqi society. They destroyed state structures, even though they are authoritarian state structures that the people would have overthrown eventually, but they did not replace them with anything that could create social cohesion. On the contrary, sowing division, sectarian, Shia against Sunni, Christian against that, and Kurd against Arab, and so on. They sowed so much division and discord and created a constitution which was so sectarian. Our press here calls it a Shia state. No, it's not a Shia state. It is a sectarian state created by instituting a sectarian constitution which brought about a state which relies heavily on political forces that sow discord in society to maintain their power. And they destroyed so much of the social cohesion and state structures, they created an environment for the growth of terrorism. And George mentioned that they haven't read Frankenstein to the end. And I say they have read it to the end, probably. They do not mind creating enemies like that. The enemies they hate are great mass movements. And these terrorists are not mass movements. They are isolated, small groups of bandits and gangsters and murderers. These are small minority type forces that the enemy, even if they don't arise, they would love to create. Because these are enemies they can ultimately deal with through a process of suppression and increased repression and more authoritarian laws. Their enemy ultimately is great mass movements, and these great mass movements are democratic movements, whether in Arab countries, Muslim countries in general, or here in Britain. George mentioned how they are spying on the media. They spy on trade unions. They spy on environmental movements. They employ secret policemen to infiltrate environmental movements here in Britain. They fear mass movements. And this is where our strength is. Appeal to the broader masses, expose the media lies, and try to reach the people where the media stops people from learning about the truth of the situation. Saudi Arabia was mentioned, Qatar, Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. All these terrorists, if not 90, about 90% of them, I would say, that crossed into Syria and beefed up ISIS, beefed up al-Nusra Front in Syria, and strengthened their presence in Iraq, came through Turkey. Until today, there is a CIA center publicly acknowledged in the United States, which was established in Turkey to coordinate the infiltration of armed men and equipment into Syria from Turkey. Until today, it's there in Turkey. They still are insisting on overthrowing the Syrian government. Israel, Henry Kissinger, and Turkey and Qatar are tactically a bit different now from the Saudi ruling family and the United States relatively, because Israel, Henry Kissinger, and some of the neocons, Turkey and Qatar, want to overthrow the Syrian government first, then handle ISIS, while Saudi Arabia and others prefer to limit the power of ISIS first, then overthrow the Syrian government. There is a tactical difference that has emerged in the area. But both these camps are anti-people camps, whether they are led by Saudi Arabia or by Turkey and Qatar in terms of the domestic and regional forces. The United States tries to balance these forces in the region. But ultimately, what they are trying in the area is sow division, sow discord, try and control the region, and ultimately even wage a war against Iran, because this area is still a powder keg. The elephant in the room that was mentioned earlier is also Israel. Israel is benefiting from what ISIS is doing and what the terrorists are doing in the region. Netanyahu is on the record. The Israeli ambassador to Washington, former ambassador who left his job only last year, is on the record as saying the bad guys, and I quote him, the bad guys that are allies of Iran and Syria are more dangerous than the bad guys of Al-Qaeda and obviously ISIS. This is how they view the region. This is what they are aiming to do. They're trying to destroy the three major Middle Eastern countries that might pose a threat in the future to Israeli expansion: Iraq, Syria, and ultimately Egypt too. These are targets for destabilization and for destroying their social cohesion and destroying them as viable societies in which the democratic movements of these countries could change these regimes, but they want to stop this process and they would rather destroy these states. Israel is now on the record as celebrating the obliteration of Sykes-Picot borders. Sykes-Picot borders were the borders created by Britain and France following World War I. These borders were hated by the peoples across the Middle East because they were created falsely by Britain and France to divide the region. Israel now is celebrating it, and on the same day that Netanyahu celebrated it, the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, in his inaugural speech of his so-called Islamic State, said the Sykes-Picot is dead. This is not the death of the Sykes-Picot that the people of the region want. What Israel is doing, what ISIS is doing, what imperialism is doing, maybe is to redraw the maps in the name of redrawing Sykes-Picot, but they want to establish weak, divided regions and states. Iraq into 3, Syria into 3 or 4 divided regions, Egypt in future, because there are about 10 million Coptic Christians in Egypt. They want to stir up that one in the long term. Places they cannot control, they want to destroy. And this is what is happening for the last 10, 15, 20 years. They have failed to control Iraq, they have failed to control Syria, they have failed to control Iran, and the economic system in the West and the crisis of capitalism is pushing them towards more aggression, where they fail to control, whether it's the oil prices, oil production, or the control of strategic region. They would rather see these societies destroyed if they cannot control them. And this is really what is behind the so-called headlines about terrorism. These are murderous terrorists, but Western policies are laying the grounds for even greater tragedies, because these big wars are killing millions, have killed millions. They killed 3 million people in Vietnam. They killed over 1 million people in Algeria. They killed over 1 million people in Iraq. They're killing hundreds of thousands of people, whether in Syria, Libya. They destroyed the Libyan state, the Syrian state, the Iraqi state, and this is what is happening in terms of the growth of terrorism, where the people's democratic movements are not allowed to flourish. So our job is to expose these lies. I know it's a hard task, but with every person's effort, especially young people in this country, this dark period, this campaigning of racism will come to an end. Thank you very much.
what I mean? He's the best teacher. Sammy, thank you very, very much indeed. Before I call Lindsay to speak, just very quick announcements. It's hashtag #NoWar2015 if you're sending out tweet messages. And there's 2 meetings to remind you of. 12th of February on Islamophobia at the NUT offices. What road's it on? It's,
I can't remember, but check on the website. Anyone know the words?
Hamilton House.
Hamilton House in, is it Mapleton Place?
Mapleton Place, that's it. See what knowledge we have here.
Yeah.
12th of February, 6:30. And on the 6th of June, an anti-war conference. That is very important because there will be a different government or whatever by that time. There's going to be a very intense debate about defence and foreign policy. That's the time for us to be fully involved, engaged and mobilised on that. So please bear that in mind. The last speaker before I call for contributions and discussion is one of the founders and convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Please welcome Lindsay German.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks for everybody's patience with this kind of the meetings, all everyone going off to the other meeting and everything else. But I think it's a fantastic turnout in terms of people wanting to be concerned about this issue. And I don't want to go through the whole things that you've now heard a whole number of speakers who've made the points about the Middle East. I don't want to repeat all of those because I'm sure we want some time for discussion. I want to make a few points though. First is that The Guardian a couple of years ago, in one of its better articles, actually said that Britain had been at war somewhere in the world every year for the last 100 years, right? Since 1914, there has always been a time when Britain has been at war. And we pay for this in all sorts of ways. We pay for it by the cost of the war and the cost of Trident and the cost of all those sorts of things. We pay for it in terms of the instability in the world. We pay for it in terms of the priorities of this society, which are very, very much to prioritise war as opposed to spending on welfare, spending on education, any of those other sorts of things. But of course we pay for it as well in the way that people look at Britain and the way that people look at Britain in the world. And in particular, we have now had this war on terror for nearly 14 years. So some people in the room probably weren't even at primary school when it started, or only just at primary school. Some of us are obviously a good bit older than that. But nonetheless, that is a fantastically long time to have a war. It's longer than the First World War, longer than the Second World War, longer than both of them put together. And it was called the War on Terror in 2001. It has singularly failed to achieve its aim. Terrorism is a much bigger threat now than it was in 2001. When 9/11 happened, everybody said that was a dreadful event. It was a shocking atrocity with 3,000 people killed in New York and Washington and elsewhere. But what we said then was very, very simple. We said that any war which tries to avenge the events of 9/11 by killing people in Afghanistan, in Iraq, since then in Libya, in Syria and elsewhere, any war that does that will create far more casualties, will create far more hostility to the Western world, and will not deal with any of the political grievances that were said at the time were the causes of the war. And let's remember, of the attack on 9/11, let's remember what they were. What they said as the reason for carrying out 9/11, and there's no justification for it, but the political reasons they gave were these. One was the state of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are in a worse position now than they were in 2001. The second was the sanctions on Iraq. Well, we don't have sanctions on Iraq anymore, but we have had a war, an invasion, an occupation, and the absolute devastation of the country. Of course, now we're bombing it again. That's the second thing. The third thing was that Al-Qaeda objected to American troops on Saudi soil. Now, if you look at the Middle East today, there are far more Western troops in far more countries than was the case back in 2001. And of course, as previous speakers have said, we now have the prospect of a British base in Bahrain a British base back east of Suez. And for those of us of my generation will remember from the 1960s that one of the main claims of the Labour government at that time was that it would withdraw all British troops and all British military intervention east of Suez. That has been reversed now, and that's quite a big reverse. It's a reverse which means that they are seeing the intervention in the Middle East not as something which just goes on for a few years, but something which is a permanent feature of what we do. And it seems to me that if you look at that, that is a very, very serious problem that we have. There are other consequences of this war. One is the attack on civil liberties. If you look at the laws that have been passed, if you look at trying to get into this building, and no doubt many of you have found that tonight, the levels of security now necessary in these places is greater than it has ever been. And we should know from the history, both of this last 13 or 14 years, and from previous history of people like the Irish who had exactly the same sorts of laws applied against them in the 1970s and 80s, most of whom, by the way, were found to have been complete miscarriages of justice, the people who ended up in prison as a result of those laws. We should know that none of them work, that the only thing that works in the end to deal with terrorism is you have to have a political solution. And if you don't have a political solution, those questions will still continue. The third problem, and it's one that perhaps I think, certainly I feel most worried about at the moment, and I guess many people here will also feel very, very worried, which is that after the events in Paris 2 weeks ago, there has been a rise in Islamophobia, there has been a rise in the number of attacks on Muslims. There was an anti-Islamic demonstration held in Dresden, as there is in Germany, as there has been every week for a number of weeks. Last week, a young African man was murdered the same night as the demonstration. There was a man murdered in the south of France, with the murderer, who was obviously seriously mentally ill, but the murderer shouting anti-Islamic slogans when he killed him. There are many, many reports in all the mosques that I hear about and the cultural centres and so on of people being abused, of people having abusive letters sent to them, and in some cases worse. In France, grenades thrown at mosques, attacks on mosques, all this kind of thing. This is a fantastically serious problem, and we have a situation where the terrorism is created or is made much, much worse by the war. The terrorism itself helps to feed this Islamophobia. We have far-right parties across Europe, in Germany, in France with the National Front, and here in Britain with UKIP, who do everything. A report set up in 2009 was supposed to deal with Tony Blair, Jack Straw, all the other people who took us to war on the basis of complete lies and fabrication, and who have never been held to account. Now, nobody knows when this report is going to come out. Is it going to come out before the election? Looks very unlikely. Will it come out just after the election? Well, it depends how much the various people who are criticised within it, including Blair, how much they actually want in any way to be criticised publicly. So even at the very simplest levels of democratic accountability, there are none. We don't want these wars. 2 million people marched against the war in 2003, and yet we are still stuck with these wars and the terrible consequences of them. And as Seamus says, this is a consequence which goes on and on and on. And it will be war without end unless we break this idea, unless we break the political consensus which says that these wars are justified and the only way you fight terrorism is by having more wars and by having more Islamophobia and more attacks on civil liberties. It is a disaster for everybody concerned, and it's something we have to reverse. Now, I just want to conclude really by saying that I think one of the most important things in this country is that because we had such a big anti-war movement, we've built a movement and a consensus among a very large proportion of the population that these wars are wrong. We've also got many, many people who don't like Islamophobia and don't like the attacks on civil liberties. But we know this is a difficult time. We know we have the media, we have government demanding all the time that Muslims have to dress in certain ways, that Muslims have to behave in certain ways, and most importantly that Muslims have to continually apologise for the fact that they opposed these disastrous wars in the first place. And all of those things, I think we have to say, are making the situation worse. So this is really a plea to everybody tonight. Thank you very, very much for coming, but don't just leave it at coming to the meeting. Please do get involved in Stop the War. Please do get active, sign up to all the activities. We have a meeting on the 12th of February on Islamophobia, which I hope you will all, and the connection with war, which I hope you will all come to. The demonstration against racism on March the 21st, which we're supporting. It's organised by all sorts of different groups in anti-racist and groups in this country. I think it has to be a very, very important demonstration. It has to be a demonstration where we stand up to racism and stand up against Islamophobia as well. So that is very important for us as well. And on the 6th of June, we're having a conference at the Trade Union TUC headquarters, where all the speakers, I hope, who have been speaking tonight, and many, many more, will come and discuss all day some of the issues we've talked about, because we have to get organised. We have to say to the government, who will try their best to ignore all this in the run-up to the election. And it isn't, incredibly in this country, it's not an election issue. You know, you can talk about all sorts of other things, but it's got nothing to do with the war. Well, let's make it an election issue. Let's make it something where we want to know what our government, what the different parties are saying about the wars, about weapons, about Trident, about Palestine, about all these questions. It should be an election issue, but it isn't just about the election. It's about how we change the policies, how we change the foreign policy, and how we begin to develop a world where we're not faced with these endless wars, but where we can begin to build justice and peace.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Before we go into the question discussion, there's two groups that I promised them some time, short amount of time, to make some very important points to you. The first one is, it's been mentioned throughout, is to invite Ahmed Ali from the Bahrain campaign to say a few words. The British have just announced an expanded base in Bahrain, and yet even the Foreign Office own website has a great deal of information about the routine human rights abuses in Bahrain. And it's been my pleasure to work with the Bahraini human rights groups for many years and to raise those issues in Parliament. So please give a very warm welcome to our friends from the Bahrain campaign, please.
I've been trying to think about how to limit what I have to say in the next 5 minutes, but I think I have to spend a minute thanking Jeremy and the rest of Stop the War, Steve, George and the rest of the speakers, really championing the cause of Bahrain when the rest of legislators in the United Kingdom government have ignored it or actively supported the contrary in Bahrain. I come to you today at a time where we are facing the darkest hour in the country. The only leading opposition figure in Bahrain, a person who's championed peace, stability, condemned violence on all sides of the conflict ever since the uprising came into existence in 2011, has been transferred to the higher criminal court where he's facing over 15 years imprisonment. This means that with the politicians' boycott of the Bahraini parliamentary elections, there are no peaceful voices left on the ground in the country. This is extremely scary. At any point, Bahrain could explode into violence, and the main reason for this is a confused UK foreign policy. I always say that one of the most difficult things, aside from dealing with a tyrant government like the Bahraini government, is dealing with the British government when it comes to the Bahraini government. Ever since 2011, the main obstacle that we found as human rights defenders, as people championing democracy, championing, talking, speaking between the opposition and the government in Bahrain, the main obstacle to that has been the United Kingdom government, specifically this Conservative Party at the moment. What we've seen since 2011 is cases of systematic torture, extrajudicial killing, crimes against humanity in the country in Bahrain, short of being drawn in by the Geneva Conventions because it's a peaceful opposition. Yet the United Kingdom government can say in its human rights report that Bahrain is on a path of reform, a path of peace, a path of existence between the government and the people. They are misleading the public while the people in Bahrain are suffering. I always think about how a coalition has been built up against the terrorist group in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. Well, when the radar should be shifted to those terrorists in the countries part of those coalition. Bahrain, suppressing the voices of democracy, the rule of law, values that are being upheld supposedly by the United Kingdom, well as leaving ISIS freely to roam in the country, preaching beheadings, preaching killings, preaching anti-Shia, preaching anti-Western values in the country, being allowed to roam freely, protesting in front of the United States embassies in the country, whereas Bahrain are walking in France championing freedom of expression. At the same time, Bahrain is the second highest imprisoner of journalists per capita, and like I said, at the same time, marching in France. It's complete hypocrisy. For this silence that the United Kingdom has shown Bahrain, they've rewarded them a base. And despite numerous questions being brought up by people like Jeremy, by Labour Front bench members, the United Kingdom is yet to answer any of those questions. How much money is that base going to cost the UK, the British taxpayer in the UK? What's the value? This is such a big shift in foreign policy, and there's been absolutely zero debate in Parliament. Where are the voices of the people in Parliament to debate this base? People like, groups like Stop the War have really championed the cause of Bahrain, and I really, really hope that the public outside this room champion it more, because the UK is basing itself as a critical ally of a government killing its people. So I really hope that your message can be spread broader, more people can come join, and the cause is really championed in terms of Bahrain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Ahmed. I hope you don't mind giving the same speech to the Grimond room.
Sure.
This is the dress rehearsal room, that's the real speech. Before we take question and discussion, there's one other group I wanted to say a few words to you. At one level you might say, what's the relevance of this? But at the other, you'll see the relevance of it. We've been talking about deaths and disappearances and human rights abuses. There's one country where there are between 25 and 40,000 people that have disappeared since 2006. And it's only the disappearance of 43 students who were demonstrating that has gained the world's attention to this problem. And so Britain, of course, is involved in promoting business with Mexico, but Britain is less involved with promoting human rights in Mexico, quelle surprise. And so what I've given some time, and I hope you agree this is very important and relevant to what we're discussing, to two friends from the Mexico Solidarity Campaign, Lupita Valdez and Claudia Leon. So if you could welcome them.
Also, thank you very much for giving us this space. We always value these spaces for us to raise our voices and to share our concerns, which I think they are not as isolated, because what I have heard so far in this room, are the same issues that we are facing nowadays in Mexico. The name of this event is A New Year of War, and even though Mexico is not considered within the conventional definition of war, Mexico has the same amount of people that are being abused and killed because of an internal war that we are having. And we have the same degrees of violence and tortures, and people are being disappeared, and well, journalists are being depressed. We have also loads of people that are being executed in extrajudicial executions. And actually, what is the link with the United Kingdom, where I think there is a very important link, especially this year. This year is considered the alliance between Mexico and the UK 2015, and it's a bilateral agreement, let's say, in terms of promoting culture, promoting tourism, promoting education, but also and mainly promoting trade and investment. However, this agenda doesn't contain human rights as a priority. And in terms of trade and investment, there is like a big mining goal in Mexico towards two sectors. First, the oil sector. Mexico just privatized oil after 70 years of the oil being nationalized. and also the security sector, which here the UK also has big companies that are related into security business, such as arms trades or naval armed guns, whatever. But there are lots of companies that are really interested in going to Mexico, such as BP and Shell, and that are not very aware, it seems weird, about the human rights crisis. And I will let my partner Lupita to talk to you about more about the crisis we are facing now on human rights in Mexico.
Hi, thank you. Well, we are appealing mainly the government because this alliance, well, as she said, doesn't include any human right addressing, and particularly in terms of security, where Britain is dealing and is sending up to 6.5 million of pounds in terms of weapons to Mexico, and this was only in 2013. And well, this is particularly worrisome because weapons are not always ending in the right hands. For example, the military, 150,000 militaries have deserted from the institution, and they usually join the organized crimes. Well, basically, they take the guns with them, and they take not only the guns, but also intelligence, and they take other equipment with them. So it's particularly worrisome because once they go, there is no control in terms of weapons, no? The weapons are there. And she was talking about in last September, 43 students were disappeared by the police in a town called Iguala in Guerrero, which is only 2.5 hours away from Mexico City. And the involvement of the local mayor was huge because he was the one that ordered the disappearance of the students, and they were delivered, the students, to a local drug gang, which they have not been found ever since. I mean, they were disappeared. And they were disappeared, and the policemen that actually did this, the guns came from Germany, for example, and Germany had banned any arms trade with Guerrero, with this particular state, because of the huge amount of violence that was happening. Yet the arms ended up in the hands of the policemen. So right now there is a huge dialogue and discussion in Germany regarding the arms trading with Mexico. And what I want to raise right now is that is particularly worrisome because also, even though the military and the policemen stay in their positions, you know, I can tell you right now that I am equally afraid of police and militaries than I am of organized crime. It is the level of collusion between these three institutions. It's evident, particularly in this case of Ayotzinapa, where they were the ones that delivered, the policemen were the ones that delivered the students to the drug gang. Which meant they were working together. And well, it's particularly important that in terms of this alliance, in this new year, the human rights situation in Mexico is addressed. I mean, the UK is interested in the new oil industry that is opening up in Mexico, but what we are pressing is that also the human rights issue is addressed. And how are we going to do this? Is we are putting pressure on, for example, on the foreign office in Mexico, and we are putting pressure on the embassy here in Mexico. So they are present in the dialogues we have with members of parliament or with members of the community, the UK community, so they understand that there is not going to be very easy to hide all these problems, to swipe them into the under the carpet, because there are more than 120,000 people killed only in the last 6 years, and those are the same levels that other countries with conventional wars are having.
And also, just to wrap up and invite you as well to join to this resistance that we're having within Mexico, just to tell you, so far, because of the collusion between the government and the criminal crime, or the other way around, Mexico, the Mexican government is not really representative of the Mexican society, and we are kind of left alone. and we need to have also your support internationally, but also here in the British government and the British public opinion, for you to also raise awareness of this situation and to be aware that all the trades that are being done are also going to affect us directly if they are not taking into account human rights. Just to mention quickly, in March there is an invitation of Enrique Peña Nieto, the President of Mexico, to come and stay at the Buckingham Palace. And this is like a big slap in the Mexican society, because we have been talking about war on terror, but I really wonder what happened then when there is a state that is supporting another state, but that is a terror state, such as the Mexican government, that has been already proved that it has been involved in all these massacres against people. So please join our causes and spread the word as well. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Questions, discussion, yes, here, and can I have an indication of those who wish to make a contribution? Okay, but please be brief and say who you are, and then we'll do a response at the end, yes?
It's obviously well known to the guys in power, and so my question is really, they have all these facts in front of them. So why do they keep doing the same things, knowing exactly what you have just stated? And just another quick point. Every single one of your predictions after the invasion of Iraq has turned out to be true. And yet, in 2011, there was the exact same scenario almost when NATO was preparing to bomb and destroy Libya. And the voices were so few and far between and so muted. What happened then? And given that it's happened, exactly as we all predicted, those who opposed it have predicted, Libya is a failed state. You know, what's going to stop the government from actually preparing exactly the same scenario if it chooses to attack Iran, for instance? It'll sell us yet another war very quickly, and we'll just shut up and accept it.
Okay. Thanks. I'll ask the panel to reply. Yes.
Yeah, was made, but there was nothing intrinsically wrong, I think, about the two pointed criticisms that were made. We're not afraid of criticism in any way. And you said you'd never seen either of them before, but David's the man that invaded and tried to arrest Tony Blair on live on television in front of hundreds of millions of people. So I don't think we should describe him as unknown. And the other point that was made, I rather like the rub of that, a civil rights movement. The Stop the War Coalition cannot do everything, but we could be a part of a civil rights movement. It's got quite a good ring to it, I think. It would have to involve a whole range of civil society organizations, but perhaps the time has come for discussions with a view to floating such a thing. We might be able to unite quite a large number of people around that. Equally, we've never been against direct action. We just ask that the direct action is helpful to the cause rather than its opposite. And you proved my point by saying we know where he lives. We should be demonstrating outside his home in St. James. But that would be foolish because he doesn't live in St. James. He lives in Los Angeles. We know that because Tony Blair was visiting his wife to see how she was when he was away on business. He lives in the United States. He doesn't live in St. James. And I recall, Lindsay, as you will, the proposition that was made to us in the run-up to the war, that on the last Saturday before Christmas, that we should block all the bridges across the Thames and thus turn 20 million English shoppers going for their last Saturday Christmas shopping against us. We're not against direct action, but it should be direct action that takes us forward rather than back, and should not be a substitute for building a mass movement of people that can actually achieve things, which brings me to Hafsa's point. you imply, Hafsa, if I may say so, that our voices were dull or stilled over the Libya war, but they were not. What was dull or stilled was the public's response to it. It wasn't for the want of trying. We held meeting after meeting, demonstration after demonstration against the war in Libya, another of our stands that has been utterly vindicated, and your struggle on the Libyan question is to be commended. But you know, we can call things, but if people don't come to them, it's not our fault. Of course we could do with new blood. We have an annual meeting, new leadership is elected regularly, and I'm sure if new candidates come forward, there'll be spaces for them. The last point I'd like to make is, in a way, the $64,000 question, and we'll all have different points of view on this. It may be because I know them better than you, because I've spent almost 30 years in this building with them. Jeremy may have the same view as me, I don't know. I insist that our rulers are not James Bonds, they're more Austin Powers. They are idiots, they are fools. Many of them are also knaves, but above all, they are fools. And it drives me mad on social media, and even one or two of the contributions here tonight, which imply that this is all just one big master plan and it's all going swimmingly from their point of view. It's about their private interests, it's about their profits and so on. I don't believe that at all. I believe the leadership of Western countries are stumbling like idiots from one disaster to the next, and are impelled, because it's bloodier to go, is it bloodier to go on or go our? They can't go back. They can't now admit that what they did led us to this, so they go on. They go on. And I'll tell you the main drawback about imagining that somebody, the Bilderberg or the Illuminati or the Freemasons or whatever, are so all-powerful that this has all been a big master plan of theirs that's going swimmingly well, is that you are actually saying to people that there's nothing can be done. These people are so clever, so powerful, so smart, they've outsmarted all of us and fooled all of us all of these years. I don't believe that. And therefore I believe they can be stopped. They can be defeated. And we did it in this building in 2013. It never occurred for one moment to David Cameron that the House of Commons would vote to stop him and thereby stop Obama from launching our Air Force into a major blitz against Syria. It never occurred to him. Even at the beginning of the debate, it never occurred to him. Trust me on that. There was no pre-planning here. I was there, I spoke, I saw the debate turn. And halfway through the debate, it began to be clear this might be closer than everybody imagines. And it was closer than they imagined, because we won and we stopped it. And because we stopped it here, Obama had to stand down in the United States. Otherwise, we'd now be at war with Syria and possibly with Iran, and have been for the last 3 years, or 2.5 years. So I caution you not to believe and not to respond to every event by imagining a conspiracy by people smarter than us. Sometimes things are conspiracies, but most of the time they're not. And because they're not, we can affect them, we can change them, we can defeat them. That's my view anyway.
Thanks, George. Andrew.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeremy. I mean, I endorse everything George has just said in relation to how Stop the War Coalition needs to go forward. We'd certainly absolutely welcome new blood, so if you're leaving now, make sure you sign up before you do, and join in our work going forward, which has seldom seemed more important. The only other point I wanted to raise was an answer to the sister who was talking about Bosnia and circumstances under which it's right to go to war. I think we should be very, very careful about ever thinking of giving any of our rulers any sense of legitimacy for their wars. There are circumstances under which wars are unavoidable and indeed are legal if one is threatened with aggression or subject to aggression, and in circumstances regarding genocide. None of these criteria have been met in any of the wars we are talking about, and moving off that principle simply empowers the stronger nations in the world, America and Britain, the right to intervene where they want in their own interests. So however tempting, however compelling the humanitarian appeal may sometimes be, we should reflect that all these wars, and I do not make any exception for those in the former Yugoslavia, have made matters far, far worse, and we should not ever give our rulers the license to go to war unilaterally.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't want to answer all the points because George and Andrew have made a number of points. Let me just say two things. The question that the German colleague said about why, why have these far-right parties started growing? Well, I date it very much. I mean, there's always been Islamophobia, but that was greatly increased by the war. But the other thing that's made a huge difference is the economic crisis from 2008. And one of the things that's happened is that rather than people blaming the bankers and the other people who caused it, there's been a whole development where people blame the people they see living next door to them, who they think in some way have an advantage over them. And I think it's a fantastically damaging thing, and I think we have to be very, very clear that this is a major problem in Europe at the moment, and it's one that we have to really campaign about, whether it's Pegida in Germany, or I saw today that they're planning to demonstrate here in Britain, and I think we have to be absolutely committed to counter-demonstrating if that turns out to be the case, and also that the demonstration on the 21st has to be as big as possible. Just one other point, which is the point about, what are the causes of the war on terror. People have different reasons why they think that happened and why they keep making these wrong decisions. One reason politicians keep making wrong decisions is they don't want to admit they were wrong. I mean, that is so they keep digging themselves into bigger and bigger holes. There's an element of that. To me, though, there is a big question here of empire and imperialism and the whole economic and military structure, which go very, very closely together. And this is what we've seen. The era of neoliberalism and the era of globalization has been an era of war. And it has been the worst wars that we've seen since any time since the Second World War. There's been more and more of them. They're not humanitarian wars. They don't actually help the people they purport to help. They make things worse. And I think this is very much part of the reason why it happened. So those are my points. I think that's all. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I'll just directly respond to the question that was addressed to me, because I apologize, I wasn't here when the other points were raised. You are right. I mean, talking to hundreds of Iraqis like I do, read the Iraqi writers and society in general in Iraq, overwhelmingly they blame the United States for the mess in Iraq. Whether you are Yazidi, Christian. I had a meeting here in London immediately after the fall of Mosul with the leaders of the Christian communities in Iraq. They were bishops and so on, and they really spoke for the Christian communities of Mosul, Baghdad, and so on. And every one of them, to my surprise, started their speeches by blaming the United States for the rise of ISIS, for the destruction of Iraqi society. This is something we don't hear in our media here. If they were sending a different message, praising the United States or Britain or France, they would have been in the front pages of the Daily Mail and the other trashy newspapers and the media in Britain. Sorry, I mean, I don't want to mince my words, but this is the truth. When it suits them, they magnify. But when Iraq's Christian leaders, the religious ones I'm talking about, say a message like that, even I, who am so close to it all, I was surprised that they would begin their speeches with denouncing the US invasion and occupation of Iraq and blaming the United States for what happened to Iraqi society. Even amongst the Kurdish people, who suffered so much under Saddam, there is a rising opinion today for blaming the United States for the threat that ISIS poses even to Erbil. The United States is claiming they are supporting the Kurdish people, but in reality they are building new military bases near Erbil, near Duhok, and so on. And unfortunately, Barzani's forces abandoned the Yazidi communities, the Christian communities. Just like the Iraqi army, they abandoned these outposts just before ISIS arrived. That's why I say there was a de facto ceasefire between Barzani's forces and ISIS. And their march so swiftly wasn't just through the collapse of the Iraqi army and their fleeing the scene, but also cooperation of former Saddam's officers and Barzani's forces occupying areas which were disputed with the central government in Baghdad, in Kirkuk, in Diyala, and in the Mosul region. And once they controlled those, they withdrew from the Yazidi and Christian areas, and ISIS marched into those areas. But when you take Iraqi society in general and the way it was destroyed, just like you look at Libya today, once you destroy a state and structures without replacing it by popular organizations and discipline, and replace these institutions with democratic ones. They were authoritarian institutions, but if you destroy them without replacing them with democratic representative institutions, then you are releasing the most vicious forces within society, especially if you consider the billions of petrodollars spent by the Saudis, the Qataris, and Turkey becoming a base with a CIA center in it to coordinate the flow of arms and fighters into Syria. Then you have a picture of people who are very politicized, whether Iraq, Syria, Palestine. They point the finger. They go much far in the picture than I do. They blame directly Israel and the United States for the creation of these terrorist organizations. Now, I don't have a proof for that, but I can see that these organizations, by their actions, are serving US interests and Israeli interests. And the people of the region are very aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just very briefly, because obviously the meeting's coming to an end, but just to pick up the point about why do the Western governments continue to invade and occupy and intervene relentlessly when the impact has been so disastrous. I mean, I agree with George that it's wrong to see it as a conspiracy and that these powers make mistakes. I mean, as I said myself, they demonstrated, in fact, the limits of Western strategic and military power rather than the extent of it, which they intended to by the war on terror, by the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the same time, you have to see it in the context of an attempt to control resources and a region which is strategically very important for Western interests. I mean, that's a fact. You know, we're talking about in the Gulf, you know, very, very major commercial investment, trade, and control of oil and gas. I mean, it's obvious, but it's true. And in Africa, you're talking about a strategic battle and a conflict which is growing with China and with the region itself trying to assert its own independence. And there's no doubt that the war on terror has been used as a vehicle. For example, the United States now has military forces in 49 out of 54 African states. I mean, some of them are small, but it's an incredible reflection of what this war on terror has been used to do in terms of building and enforcing Western strategic presence against potential adversaries and competitors. So, I mean, although it's only one part of the picture, it is a major part of the picture that control of hydrocarbon resources in the Middle East is at the core of the attempt to dominate and control it. But without seeing it in a very crude conspiratorial sense, I think that is the case. It's also about the assertion of Western power in the post-Cold War era and using this opportunity as a way of doing that. And it's obviously gone wrong in very important ways, even as people have spelt out in their own interests. But of course, in terms of the interests of the people of the region and the interests of the people of these of the countries that are intervening, it's been a disaster. So.
In closing the meeting, could I first of all thank everyone for coming and for all our speakers and all the contributions that have been made. because this evening's meeting was meant to be, and it's been a very successful event, in informing people and encouraging that kind of analysis and discussion, which you won't hear on the BBC, you won't hear on Sky, Fox News wouldn't even begin to understand it, and it would have to be on Al Jazeera or maybe one or two others to even get a beginning of that kind of discussion or debate, because Fox News are completely taken up with their obsession with Birmingham. Maybe somebody should tell them something about Birmingham. I was very struck by the point George made about public perceptions and opposition. Yes, we did get a massive turnout on demonstrations against the invasion of Iraq. We were actually founded opposing the invasion of Afghanistan, and Iraq came along some 2 years later. We managed to get we think about 40 MPs to vote against the operations in Libya. Where were we wrong? Because look at the chaos that Libya is in at the present time. But we then had the vote on Syria, and we also had a very important vote on the recognition of Palestine. And I felt that in both of those votes in Parliament, every person that ever leafleted, petitioned, emailed or demonstrated or marched or met was a contributory factor to those two very, very important votes. Don't ever give up on protest or the right to protest. And tomorrow there's going to be a debate on the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile system on a motion put down by the Scottish Nationalists and by Plaid Cymru. But the motion is absolutely clear. It just says opposition to the replacement of the Trident nuclear missile system. Social media is a wonderful thing. And somebody's just sent me a tweet to say, I hope their figures are correct, that spending £100 billion on replacing the Trident nuclear missile system is the equivalent of spending £136,000 for every single day since Jesus Christ was born. Now, you can check the figures, it's not difficult. 2014 times 365 divided into 100 billion, see what you get and tell me the figure. But think about that for a moment. 100 billion pounds on a weapon of mass destruction that, if ever used, would bring about a global environmental disaster, a nuclear winter, economic chaos, mass starvation, any nuclear weapon used anywhere. Why are we even contemplating renewal of something so appalling and so abominable? And it hasn't brought anybody any security anywhere. What brings security? Jobs, schools, hospitals, houses, respect, homes, respect for different faiths, different religions, different conventions and different communities. But the madness, and it is the madness, of the reaction to 9/11 was to invade Afghanistan, was to take a war against Iraq, as which George quite correctly pointed out. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there was none of that kind of thing, and instead we've now unleashed a global war. Who benefits from that war? Oil companies that get the oil, even though the price has gone down quite a lot. Those that make lots of money, like Blair and Bush and Cheney, etc., out of the war, and those that sell arms to promote security all around the globe. And so the horrors that's been now meted out to the people of Syria, to the people of Libya, to the people of northern Nigeria and other places are, I believe, all a direct consequence of the war on terror of 2001. We're not going to solve all of that or change all of that tonight. But I tell you this, if we weren't out there saying that, we weren't out there marching, we weren't out there demonstrating, there would be no opposition whatsoever to this comfortable global media consensus that all you need is more bombs, more arms, and ignore the human rights and consequences of all of that. So tonight has sought to bring us together on that. Lindsay made the announcements about the anti-racist demonstration, about the public meeting we're organising at the NUT, and of course the Stop the War conference in June. Don't underestimate the potentials in the next Parliament. It's going to be a very interesting and I suspect very complicated election result. There are opportunities within all of that to put for a different foreign policy, based on human rights, based on justice, based on sharing resources, not stealing resources. That surely is something that we can all unite around. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And if you could leave the room neatly, because the staff here have been incredibly helpful to us this evening. So say thank you to the staff on the desk as you go out. They've been really helpful about our overflow meetings.
Thank you.